Naomi Carter walked into her dream job interview, only to be completely ignored while less qualified candidates were called in before her. But instead of walking away, she did something that left everyone speechless. The waiting room was cold, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. It was the kind of space designed to be functional, not inviting. Glass walls framed the sleek, modern lobby, reflecting the busy cityscape outside. A receptionist typed away at her computer, barely acknowledging the few candidates scattered across the room. Among them sat Naomi Carter. She adjusted the sleeves of her navy blue blazer, her fingers brushing against the carefully pressed fabric. She had spent hours preparing for this interview, researching the company, rehearsing answers, reminding herself that she was qualified. More than qualified. But as she looked around, she couldn't ignore the subtle but undeniable difference in how she was being treated. Across from her, a young man in a tailored suit sat scrolling on his phone. Every few minutes, a staff member would walk by and greet him with a nod, a smile, acknowledgement. Another candidate, a woman with sleek blonde hair and an expensive-looking portfolio, was approached by the hiring manager herself with a warm, almost familiar exchange. But Naomi? She had walked in with confidence. She had checked in at the front desk. She had taken a seat like the others. And yet, it was as if she was invisible. Minutes passed, then 20, then 40. Candidates who had arrived after her were being called in. One by one, they disappeared behind the large glass doors leading to the interview rooms. But Naomi remained seated, her presence seemingly overlooked. She shifted slightly in her chair, straightening her back. A quiet frustration bubbled beneath her composed exterior. Did they forget about her? Or were they choosing to ignore her? Naomi had encountered situations like this before. Boardrooms where she was the only black woman, meetings where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by someone else, networking events where she had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. She exhaled slowly. No, she wasn't going to let this moment define her. She was going to make sure they saw her. And what happened next? No one in that office would forget it. Naomi checked the time on her phone. 53 minutes. She had been sitting there for nearly an hour, while other candidates were ushered in within minutes of arrival. She glanced at the receptionist, a young woman with a headset on, typing rapidly. Naomi cleared her throat and leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice calm but firm. The receptionist barely looked up. "Yes. I checked in nearly an hour ago for my interview with Mr. Reynolds. I've seen other candidates go in, but I haven't been called yet. Is there a delay?" The receptionist blinked, clearly caught off guard. She hesitated, then quickly scanned her computer screen. "Oh, let me check." Naomi watched as the woman clicked through her screen, her fingers moving faster than necessary, as if trying to cover up an oversight. A moment later, the receptionist's expression flickered with something Naomi recognized all too well, guilt. They hadn't forgotten. They had ignored her. Yeah, it looks like your name was accidentally left off the list. I'm really sorry about that. I'll let Mr. Reynolds' assistant know now." Naomi nodded, keeping her expression unreadable. Accidentally left off? A convenient excuse. A few feet away, a group of employees chatted by the water cooler, their laughter easy and familiar. Naomi noticed the way they glanced in her direction, eyes flicking over her before looking away, uninterested. She could feel it, the unspoken assumption. She didn't look like she belonged. And then, just as the receptionist picked up the phone, a tall man in a crisp gray suit strode into the waiting area. Mr. Reynolds, the hiring manager. His gaze swept over the room. He extended a hand to the young man with the tailored suit, the same one who had arrived after Naomi. "Ethan, right on time. Let's get started." Naomi's fingers curled slightly into her lap. Ethan had arrived nearly 30 minutes after her. Her heart pounded, not from nerves, but from the quiet, familiar sting of dismissal. She could stand up now. She could demand an explanation. She could walk out, tell them exactly how wrong this was, how unfair. Instead, she inhaled deeply, centering herself. No, she would handle this differently. She wouldn't just make them see her. She'd make them remember her. Her moment was coming. And when it did, it would change everything. Naomi adjusted her posture, her mind sharpening with resolve. If they weren't going to acknowledge her, she would make them. She stood up. The movement, though subtle, drew attention. The receptionist looked up first, her fingers hesitating on the keyboard. A few employees near the water cooler stopped talking, their gazes flickering toward Naomi. Even Mr. Reynolds, who had been leading Ethan toward the interview rooms, paused ever so slightly. Naomi stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She approached Mr. Reynolds directly, her presence exuding quiet authority. "Excuse me, Mr. Reynolds." He turned, visibly surprised. He glanced at her blazer, her poised stance, then at Ethan, almost as if trying to piece together whether she was someone important. "Yes," he said, his tone polite but detached. Naomi met his gaze head-on. "My name is Naomi Carter. I checked in nearly an hour ago for my interview with you. Yet I've watched multiple candidates who arrived after me be called in before me." The room fell silent. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. Ethan looked away. Mr. Reynolds frowned, clearly caught off guard. "That must have been an oversight." Naomi didn't let him finish. "An oversight?" she repeated, her voice unwavering. "That's interesting because I'm sure I saw my name on the confirmation email from your team. Yet somehow I was accidentally left off the list. Somehow I was the only one made to wait. So I have to ask, was it truly an oversight? Or was I simply not the kind of candidate you expected to see?" A ripple of tension spread through the room. The employees at the water cooler exchanged nervous glances. The receptionist shifted in her chair, avoiding Naomi's eyes. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, I assure you, this was not intentional." Naomi smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile. It wasn't even confrontational. It was the smile of someone who had played this game before and knew exactly how it worked. "Whether it was intentional or not, I want to be very clear about something." She took a step closer, her voice steady. "I am not here because I need this job. I am here because your company reached out to me. Your team saw my experience, my skills, and my leadership in the industry, and they decided I was worth interviewing. And yet, when I walked into this room, I was treated as if I was invisible. As if my presence here was a mistake." Mr. Reynolds opened his mouth but closed it again. He had no real defense. Naomi exhaled and straightened her shoulders. "But let me tell you what I've learned. I've learned that when people overlook you, when they try to make you small, the most powerful thing you can do is take up space anyway. So here I am. You can choose to dismiss me, or you can choose to actually see me. Either way, I promise you, you will remember my name." The weight of her words hung in the air. A long pause. Then, something shifted in Mr. Reynolds' expression. A flicker of realization. A slow nod. He saw her now. And nothing would ever be the same. The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Mr. Reynolds glanced around, as if suddenly aware of the stares from his own employees. The receptionist wouldn't meet Naomi's eyes. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Even the water cooler conversations had come to a halt. Naomi had done more than just call out the oversight. She had held up a mirror. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. "Miss Carter, you're right." His voice was quieter now, stripped of its earlier authority. "This shouldn't have happened." Naomi raised an eyebrow. She had expected an excuse, not an admission. "You're absolutely right," he continued, his posture shifting, as though a weight had settled on his shoulders. "You should have been called in immediately. And there's no excuse for that." A slow murmur spread through the room. Some employees exchanged glances, perhaps realizing, perhaps reflecting. The receptionist suddenly busied herself with her keyboard, guilt etched on her face. Naomi let the moment hang before speaking. "I appreciate you saying that, Mr. Reynolds. But an apology isn't enough. The real question is, what will you do about it?" A beat of hesitation. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Reynolds extended a hand. "If you're still interested, I'd like to conduct this interview personally. Right now." Naomi studied him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she reached out and shook his hand. "All right," she said. "Let's talk." As they walked toward the interview room, the weight in the air shifted. The power dynamic had changed. Naomi wasn't just another candidate anymore. She had commanded respect. And in doing so, she had left an undeniable mark on everyone in that office. One by one, the employees who had ignored her before now watched with something else in their eyes. Respect. Reflection. Because Naomi had done what so many wished they could. She hadn't just demanded to be seen. She had made them remember her. The door to the interview room closed behind Naomi and Mr. Reynolds, but the impact of what had just happened lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge. Back at the receptionist's desk, the young woman swallowed hard, glancing at the screen where Naomi's name had been sitting all along. She exhaled, shoulders sagging with guilt. Near the water cooler, the employees who had once ignored Naomi's presence stood in thoughtful silence. One of them, a junior associate, murmured, "She really called them out." "Yeah," another replied. And she wasn't wrong. Even Ethan, the candidate who had been favored without question, looked unsettled, as if realizing for the first time that his path had been smoother not just because of his qualifications, but because of the assumptions people made the moment he walked in. Inside the interview room, Naomi sat across from Mr. Reynolds, her posture poised, her confidence unshaken. "Before we begin," she said, meeting his gaze evenly, "I'd like to know, are you considering me because of my qualifications? Or because you feel like you have to?" Mr. Reynolds leaned back, exhaling. He had been in this business for years, yet no interview had ever begun like this. He nodded slowly. "Because you're qualified. More than qualified." Naomi studied him for a moment, then gave a small, knowing smile. "Good. Beyond that office, the world would go on as it always did. People would be overlooked. Bias, both conscious and unconscious, would persist. But today, in this room, something had changed. Because Naomi Carter had refused to shrink. And in doing so, she had made them all think twice. And that was how real change began. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt unseen? What did you do? Let's talk in the comments. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge, uplift, and spark change. Remember, your voice matters. Use it.